There we go. Jim Highsmith, welcome to the podcast. I'm really happy to have you over here. You're a co-author of the Agile Manifesto, and you have I'm a big fan of your work, so thank you for being here. And maybe we can start by asking you if you can share with us a brief story of who is Jim, right?
Well, thank you, Hector. It's good to be here. Who is Jim? Well, that's a long story. It's taken 70 plus years to write that story. So I'll kind of hit the highlights. I started my career as an electrical engineer in 1966, working on the Apollo program. And as I quipped to some people, means my first project was a success. And I worked through what I call the Wild West era, which was the 70s and early 1980s, when there was not much to go on. There were a few books on languages such as COBOL or Fortran, but there wasn't much on design or requirements definition. I became involved in the structured movement in the 1980s, and then in the 1990s began to switch to rapid application development and eventually to Agile. So I've been a part of the Agile community now for some 23 years, from the inception which kind of started with the Agile Manifesto, through today, where things are, we're still going strong 20 years later, but there's some bumps and warts to work on.
Thank you, Jim. Yeah, that's awesome. So I would like to, as a next step, I would like to walk through the books that you have created. Maybe you can share some insights of what the book is about, what's the value behind it, and then what would be the audience, right? So the first book that you wrote is called Adaptive Software Development in 1999. Is this correct?
That's correct.
So what is it about? Who would you recommend it to, and what's the message over there?
Well, it's one of the first two books on Agile that came out about the same time. I had shared my manuscript for adaptive software development with Kent Beck, who was writing XP string programming book. And these came out in the late 2000, about a year before the Agile Manifesto was written. And so they both were sort of entree books into the movement. It's kind of interesting today. You can look up the 100 best Scrum books, or the 150 best Agile books. The number of books have proliferated, but these were the first two sort of books that attacked what we then began calling Agile. So I would say that the benefit of both XP Explained and my book, Adaptive Software Development, would be to give people insight into the origins of the Agile movement and why it occurred, and a little bit of background as to what was going before and what created the need or the demand for something like the Agile Manifesto. So I think if I go back and look at either Kent's book or my book, there's still some things in there that are still useful today, but I think mainly as a historical reference of kind of understanding where things came from. And that's actually why I wrote the last book that we'll get to in a few minutes.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. So then you have, in 2002, you created the book Agile Software Development Ecosystems, right? What is this about, this new terminology, ecosystems, right?
Well, I started the background for this book, or the research for this book, at the manifesto meeting. And I, in fact, interviewed a couple of the people there that I put in the book. So at that point in time, there wasn't much known about what had previously been lightweight methodologies and was now agile methodologies. And so I wanted to do kind of a survey book on the different agile methodologies, who proposed them, who was involved in them, what they had to say, and a little bit about how you took these things and designed your own methodology. So I talked about XP, and I interviewed Kent Beck. I talked about Scrum and interviewed Ken Schwaber. I talked about Crystal and interviewed Alistair Coburn. And I talked about adaptive software development and had Alistair Coburn interview me. And so there were interviews with the guys that were at the core of the Agile movement during that period of time. And so that book was sort of a survey book And I think it served its purpose of getting a little bit about all the different Agile methodologies and what was common and what was different among those different methodologies.
Awesome. Thank you. We will talk more about the Agile Manifesto. I have a bunch of questions that, as you may imagine, right? So then 2004, we have another book, Agile Project Management, Creating Innovative Products. Innovative, right? So innovative is kind of the buzzword over here, right? How did you focus the Agile mindset into innovation?
Well, one of the things that occurred as the Agile movement kind of unfolded in the early years is there seemed to be a bias against management, particularly project management, because project management had been very waterfall oriented for many years. It was a command control kind of project management. And so there was a rebellion against that type of management. And so you saw, like Scrum, for example, went to something called a Scrum Master. Now, the Scrum Master's role was not equivalent to project management, project manager, but it was similar in nature, although the Scrum role was more of a coaching role than a management role. So I and a group of other people got together in 2004 at the Agile conference and said we wanted to promote a different style of project management, an Agile style of project management, rather than a prescriptive style of project management. So we wanted to maintain the good part of project management, which we thought was still necessary, but make it more agile. And so that was the genesis of the book, Agile Project Management, which has been really my best-selling book to date. It's still selling now, some 20 plus years later. I did write an updated version in 2009, which had some changes in it, but the philosophy and the basics were the same.
Oh, nice. Okay. Yeah, I'm looking at the other one. It's called the same, right? So then it's an updated version. Then you go to 10 years later, you write EDGE, Value-Driven Digital Transformation, right?
Right.
What is this about?
EDGE was a combination. I wrote it with two other people, Linda Liu and David Robinson. We all worked at ThoughtWorks at the time. And we had a meeting in 2005 timeframe where we were looking at what could we do or what should we do in relation to scaling agility or scaling Agile. And what came out of that meeting was really the feeling that we didn't necessarily want to scale Agile to bigger organizations, but what we wanted to do was to scale innovation. And that was really a CIO question, which really said we needed to evolve the business side as well as the IT side into a more agile approach. So we wrote EDGE for that marketplace, and it was based on the experience that the three of us had had at ThoughtWorks working with big companies and trying to make this agile transformation.
Okay, who would be the audience for this book? Maybe product owners, product managers, or vice presidents of product
managers, executives who were looking to transform their organizations to something what we're currently calling a digital organization, transformation of the organization in terms of its culture, in terms of its products, which obviously turns out to be a fairly difficult task.
Yeah, I see. Okay, so then the last one, 2023, May. This is the newest one, right? Wild West to Agile, Adventures in Software Development Evolution and Revolution. Let's talk about this one.
Yeah, well, this book came about. I had retired from ThoughtWorks, and COVID had hit, so I was sort of locked up like everybody else was. And I started thinking about what I was going to do next. And I had sort of been thinking about this for quite some time, but I decided that one of the things I wanted to do was to write a memoir for my grandkids so that they would know a little bit more about me and how I did things and what was important to me. So I had two sections kind of planned out a little bit. One was an adventure section that talked about all the adventure activities that I had, from mountain climbing to mountain biking to sailboat racing and all the other things that I had done over a lifetime of sort of looking at adventurous kinds of activities. And then the second section was sort of on my career. And in looking at that, I thought, well, I don't want to do something that's like sort of like a resume. From this time to this time, I did this. And so I hit on looking at the different eras of software development and technology for about 60 years. And I divided it into 4 eras: the Wild West era, the structured era, the roots of Agile era, and the Agile era. And then I wrote about each one of those. And as I began developing this, I thought it might have some wider implications or some wider interest. And so I asked a couple of friends of mine if they thought it had wider interest, and they said it did. And so I was encouraged to go ahead and turn it from just a personal memoir into a book. And so part of the reason behind that was I saw a lot of stuff going on in the industry today, but very little about the history of software development. And it's sort of a historical memoir in that it's a lot of my stories about where I worked and what I did, and tied me into different software development movements that occurred over time. And so it was very personal. It was a memoir. It was a history. And I really wanted to do it for several different reasons: to talk about the history of software development, to talk about how it was intertwined with business and technology, to talk about the people who were kind of pioneers in the movement, and then to really look at, like I said, the industry and business. So all of those braids kind of came together in this book. And one of the things I've done, for example, recently is in the book, one of the purposes I say of the book is that history's role is not to help us predict the future, but to prepare us for it. And so I got to thinking about that, and thinking about, I had a conference talk coming up, and I thought, well, maybe what I ought to do is apply that to my own conference talk. So I'm actually doing a conference talk on applying history to AI, to see what history has to say about the artificial intelligence movement and how we might approach it, understanding a little more of its history. So those are the kinds of things that I bring out in that book.
Oh, that's pretty interesting. And what do you think about these new technologies? How would they affect the agile ways of working right now?
Well, I think what happens is if you look at methodology, there's really 3 levels of things. There are methods, there are methodologies, and their mindset. So you've got methods or practices like pair programming or feature-driven development are practices. Then you have practices that are brought together into a methodology that really talks about each phase in a life cycle, whether it's an iterative life cycle or whether it's a waterfall life cycle. It really talks about what kinds of things go on from inception to development to the product being installed. And so that's what a methodology does. And then on top of that, you've got a mindset or culture. And culture really determines how you apply the methodology. So if you have a very fixed mind culture, they would approach your methodology one way. Where you have a very growth-minded culture, they would approach a methodology a different way. So you've got all 3 of those. So what happens when you get new technologies in, a lot of practices change. So take refactoring as a practice. Well, maybe you have an automated tool that automates refactoring. And so you don't need that as a practice anymore. You replace it with a tool. So I think in terms of methodology, you may alter your methodology depending on the tools that you have at the time. Just to think about the difference, for example, when I started and now. When I started in engineering school, we were designing circuits using transistors that are about as big as the end of my finger for each individual transistors. Today, on one silicon chip, you have 5 billion transistors. And so that's a huge gamut. And so every time the technology has changed to some extent, the methods that you use and the methodologies that you use to approach those kinds of software development will change. The mindset, at least for now, an agility, adaptive mindset is really required because of the pace of change. So where the methodology may change and the practices may change, the mindset's going to remain the same for the foreseeable future.
Got it. Makes a lot of sense. And the mindset is there, right? Is the soul of the mindset would be the Agile Manifesto. So, Jim, looking back, would you say the Agile Manifesto achieved what you and the other co-creators hoped it would, or it exceeded?
Well, obviously it way exceeded, because I'm not sure that we had hopes that were anywhere near to what has happened. We just thought that there was some common denominators amongst those people. We didn't like being called lightweight methodologists, and so we got together to sort of explore the commonalities and the differences. And I don't think any of us ever imagined the kind of market acceptance that there was going to be, and the proliferation of Agile throughout many corporations and many organizations. It became sort of the way we do things today. I mean, I know people that have graduated from college in the last 5, even 10 years, and they've never done anything but Agile development. And so it's interesting how widespread it's become. And as we may get into later, there have been some bumps and bumps along the road, some things that happened that we anticipated, some things that we didn't anticipate, some things we would say went correctly, and some things we said they're maybe didn't go like we intended. But I don't think any of us had any idea that it would take off like it did.
Yeah, I'm sure. So, how did the creative process work in that session, right? Were you all agreeing, or hey, yeah, interactions and individuals is more important than process and tools? Let's put it over there. Everyone agrees. Yes, we vote. What was the dynamic to start creating this document?
Well, it was a very, you had 17 sort of type A iconoclasts, very individualistic, very adventurous. And so you would think that trying to corral those 17 people into agreeing on something would be pretty difficult, and it was. But we started out the first day and went around the room, and all the 17 people described what they were doing and how they were doing it, and their particular methodology. And so we got an idea in going around the room of what each person's contribution was, what were the similarities and what were the differences. And what we were looking for was similarities, so that we could come out of there with some sort of joint resolution that said, here is a bunch of lightweight methodologists that have got together, and they have decided or formed something that was a written document that says, here's what we believe, and here's what we think software development, at least within certain domains, ought to be moving over the future. And so it was a very collaborative meeting. It was a very open meeting, one of the best meetings I've ever attended, because we were actively listening to each other as well as talking, although obviously there was some talking over each other at times. I think it came together pretty easily in terms of voting. I mean, I don't even remember. I remember going through and constructing the manifesto values. I don't really remember much about the voting process. I think it sort of evolved from that. And I don't remember being very difficult to get agreement on the basic fundamental values.
That's great. It's so interesting to know a little more about that moment. Thank you for sharing. Jim, has your personal interpretation of the Agile Manifesto's principles evolved over years, or are they just the way they were thought at the beginning? They are good that way.
Well, that's a good question. Because it's one that gets asked a lot. Has my thought evolved? Yes. Do I think there's still some basic fundamental value in the value statements of the Agile Manifesto? Yes, I do. But there's the strict constructionalists who look at the manifesto and say, this means these words are sacrosanct. So when it says program delivery, it means program. It doesn't mean you can do anything else with it. There are other people who would take that statement and say it applies more widely to products or solutions or services. Different types of outcomes would be appropriate for that. So I think that the manifesto is a historical document. It's not going to change. But I think what's going to change is what I call extensions to the manifesto document. And there's some of those floating around out there. For example, when I founded an Agile Project Leadership Network to look at the ideas about project management, we came up with a set of value statements or principle statements. I can't remember how many there were, 5 or 6, that looked a little bit different than the Agile Manifesto, but essentially could be derived from the values in the manifesto. And they were particularly for project managers. So there was a different document that took the manifesto values and principles and revised them to some extent to focus on project managers. If you look at, for example, the SAFE document, SAFE did the same thing. You look at the values in the SAFE system, and whether you like SAFE or don't like SAFE is not important right here. But those values, you can actually look at each of those values and see how it was derived from the values or the principles of the Agile Manifesto. So I think the Agile movement has grown so big now that there'll never be a manifesto for Agile development that meets the needs of all the different branches. So you may have a branch that's a project management branch that has a set of principles and values derived from the Agile Manifesto. You might have a Scrum set of values that's derived from the Agile Manifesto. You may have a product management set that's derived from the Agile Manifesto. You may have a leadership set that was derived from the manifesto. I don't want people to look at the manifesto as a static piece of historical document. I want them to look at it as an inspiration for going forward and extending into other areas. So I think when you look at the Agile movement today, you sort of look at what is it that the Agile movement that's been a success for 20 years, what did it do right? What is it that needs to be maintained? What is it that we need to preserve? And then what needs to change, and how do we need to change it? So both extension is and stuff that's new. And so I think the basic document's never going to be rewritten and shouldn't be rewritten, because the Agile movement is too big today to have one document that drives everything. So I think what you'll have is a clarification of what's in the Agile Manifesto, a extension of what's there, and adding some new stuff too.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Jim, do you remember any moments or any reactions from the tech community or from the software development community that made you think, oh, this is something big, right? Like, for example, I can imagine you get together with a bunch of friends and create a song, and then there's this moment when you hear the song in the radio that you say, oh my God, we did that. This is big, right? Did you have this moment, like when you realized this was something very big?
Yeah, it's interesting. This was in 2001, 2002, 2003. And you have to remember, this was before social media got big. And so you didn't have a Facebook, and you didn't have a LinkedIn, you didn't have a Twitter to spread the word. But you had a couple of things, one of which was a brilliant idea by Ward Cunningham. He put up a wiki that basically was the discussion of, started out being XP, but then it went to Agile. We put the manifesto up on the web, and then again at Ward's creative idea to have give people the ability to sign on to the manifesto and be sort of supporting co-authors. And then the way the message was distributed was through conference talks, articles. So Martin Fowler and I wrote an article in the summer of 2001 in Software Development Magazine. Alistair Coburn and I wrote one in IEEE Software in the fall of 2001. Several other people were writing articles in magazines. Remember, back then we had magazines. Now we have online newsletters, and you can distribute things a lot faster. So I think, for an author, the biggest notice that you've made an impact is when somebody comes up to you at a conference and says, you really changed the way I approach software development, or what you said really changed my life. I mean, those are words of gratitude to authors who spend a lot of time hunkered down writing stuff and are glad to see anybody that that really gets something out of it, which is what we intended.
Got it. Okay. Jim, were there any external influences? Well, you mentioned already XP, but could you mention some of the inspirational documents that shaped the manifesto? I know that for that moment, Scrum was already there, right? XP was already there. Am I correct? So these were two. Do we have more?
Yeah. So there was XP, there was Scrum, which was the two well-known ones. Scrum got to be well-known after that. When the manifesto was written, XP was probably in front in terms of recognition. Then you had Alistair Coburn's Crystal approach. You had feature-driven development that came out of Australia. You had DSDM that came out of Europe. You had adaptive software development that was mine. You had some people working on lean software development. So there were a number of threads that came together during that manifesto meeting. And the other thread that sort of drove a lot of us was this idea of complex adaptive systems and how they work, and using that as an analogy or a metaphor for how software needed to be managed and developed. So that was another common thread that ran at least through adaptive development, Scrum, XP, and some others. So it was a common thread that was really important.
Well, it looks like all these theories or documents were coming from many parts of the planet, right? So I can imagine that it was a challenge for someone to get everyone together, right? How did you get an invite, or how did that happen, right? How did you ended up all together?
Well, there were really two events that happened. There was a meeting prior to the Agile Manifesto meeting, about a year before that Kent Beck called in Oregon. And it was basically a meeting for XP individuals, XP proponents, to talk about the future of XP. But you had a lot of the people there that ended up at the manifesto meeting. And they invited a couple of, quote, outsiders who were not XP proponents to the meeting, and I was one of those. So that was a meeting that got started, and then Bob Martin, after that meeting, started thinking about a wider group of people. And so he sent out an email and said, here's a group that I think ought to be contacted, or that I think ought to be involved. Do you know any other people? So, for example, I don't know who proposed that we contact the DSDM people. It might have been me. I knew about DSDM. Feature-driven development, which was done by a guy out of Australia, and I think he was invited, but he couldn't come. That was probably too far to come for a 2-day meeting. So it was just sort of people that we knew who were doing something that looked like it might be a lightweight approach to methodology, and we ended up inviting them. And these were the 17 people who showed up. And I know there are a couple of people who were invited who decided not to come, who could kick themselves for years afterward.
Yeah, of course. Did you ski over there? Did you have some drinks, or?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Like, did you have some fun skiing, or did you have some drinks, or what else did you do other than creating the manifesto?
We had a few drinks together, and several of us went skiing. I know Alistair Coburn and I went skiing, and I think James Grennan went skiing, and Martin Fowler. So there were a half a dozen of us that went skiing, another half who sort of sat in the bar and had a drink and furthered the discussion. So there was some playtime as well as work time during the meeting.
Nice. Thanks for sharing. Jim, you mentioned something about SAFe. What's your position about SAFe? Is it agile or is it not agile? What do you think?
Well, the argument for SAFe is that there are a lot of companies out there, big companies, who need a scaled approach to agility and need something like SAFe because they got large organizations to transform. The downside of that is, and this is the case for any methodology, not just SAFe, but it becomes prescriptive as opposed to adaptive. And what I mean by that is you get a set of rules and you put those rules into place, and then they become locked in concrete and they don't change. Whereas an adaptive methodology says, I adapt the methodology to the situation at hand, whether it be a company or whether it be a project. And so leaning is always towards a more adaptive methodology that changes over time. There are people who have the right mindset for implementing SAFe, and there are people that have the wrong mindset for implementing SAFe. And one of the issues is there's a very prescriptive mindset, a more traditional command control mindset that governs a lot of big companies. So they're attracted to things like SAFe because it appears to them to be prescriptive and something they can impose on their staffs. But that's not the way that some of the SAFe people intend it to be. So it depends a lot on mindset as to, one of the things I've noticed over 60 years is that I've seen every methodology succeed and I've seen every methodology fail. I was involved in a lot of really good systems development in the 1980s that were waterfall oriented. I didn't think that they persisted into the Agile era because of the business need for increased speed. So there was a reason for that changeover from structured methods to Agile methods. So I think things like SAFe, as I like to tell people, I believe in Jerry Weinberg's statement of raspberry jam, which is the wider you spread it, the shallower it gets. So what happens is you start out with a really robust XP or Scrum or whatever. And what happens as you disperse it to more and more people, it gets thinner and thinner and thinner. And so pretty soon, all you're left with is people who really can apply the practices, but don't really understand the mindset. And so you have to do more with them to explain the mindset to them. And so that's really one of the differences between what I'd call prescriptive methodologies and adaptive methodologies.
Got you. Thank you. So the mindset is more important, right? You can fail with any light framework like Scrum or Kanban if you don't have the right mindset, right? So that's what I'm getting, right? Okay. Jim, have you seen in your career many examples, or do you have some examples, or could you recall some situations where the Agile Manifesto is being used in ways that it was not intended for? Like, I created this and this is not how it's supposed, or is misunderstood?
I think there are several ways in which it's understood. Number one is if you look at the value statements in the Agile Manifesto, it says over. So it says individuals and interactions over process and tools. It does not say instead of. It does not say instead of. It says over, which means one is more important than the other, but that doesn't mean that the other is unimportant. And I think this has been really misinterpreted quite widely, that over means in place of, instead of. So if you read that, it would be individuals and interactions instead of processes and tools. So you don't need processes and tools anymore. That's a misinterpretation of what over is all about. The word over is really important because it helps you make decisions. The hardest thing to do in software development or any kind of product development is make decisions as you go through the process. And so you need guides to help you make decisions. When you're making decisions about a methodology, you need to see what methodology is going to be appropriate for the people and the collaboration and interactions that I have within my organization, and then the process and tools. If you want to look at something, you can turn the words around in there and see if they make sense. So does it make sense that processes and tools are more important than people in their interactions? I don't think so. I would rather have good, smart, skilled people and a mediocre methodology and tools rather than the best methodology and tools and mediocre skilled people. And so you can turn each of those things around. But I think that's where one area of misinterpretation. The other misinterpretation is people who think that the manifesto really is set in stone, like stone tablets that can't change and don't change and become just about a fervor that says, you're not agile if you don't do X. I wrote a LinkedIn post not long ago that said, who gets to say whether something is agile or not? You know, it really is personal in terms of your person, your team, your organization, for you to say I think I'm agile, or I think I'm agile enough, or I think I'm agile, but I have a ways to go. I don't need anybody externally saying, well, if you don't do this, you're not agile. I think that's a problem.
Got it. Thanks for sharing, Jim. So I interviewed one person a few months ago, and he mentioned the way that he understood the manifesto was the least amount of process and tools I can use to create individuals and interactions. The least amount of comprehensive documentation I can use to create working software. So will this work?
Yeah, that sort of work. It says, I don't know if it means the least amount, but it means that when I have, let's say I have an investment decision to make, I can either pay my employees more, or I can buy the new fanciest tools. What weighs on that decision? And it may be the fact that the manifesto says one is more important than the other. It's not that the other is unimportant. So maybe I change my investment decision a little bit to put more money into the people and their skills, and a little less money into tools. So it's a way of giving some people some criteria that helps them make decisions.
Got it. Jim, getting back to that moment, that year when the manifesto was published, right? Was it like a revolution for the planet? Like everyone creating software said, like, "Oh, this is contrary to everything we have done," or was it more of a gathering of the notes, and then we continue just they put it all together, and we can continue just polish the way that we were doing it? How was it took from the external persons?
Well, it really depends. It depends on what kind of company you work for, and it actually depends on where you were in the world. There were a lot of people, particularly Silicon Valley people, who said, "So what's new? That's the way we've always worked." There were some people that said, "Boy, that's too much structure. We don't need all that structure." And there were other people that said, "This is a heresy. This is what you need is a very structured, big documentation approach to software development." So there was stuff on both sides of the equation. I think what we got a lot was, you put a name to what we've been doing. You've showed us that there are other people that are doing the same thing and struggling with the same thing. And that's really important, that we know that other people are out there. And so I think that you got those different kinds of reactions. If you look at the implementation of Agile over those first few years, it was what I call the rogue team era, where you had teams of individuals in some big companies and in some little companies, and the team would say, "We want to try Agile." And somebody would say, "Okay, go ahead. You can try a pilot project or an initial project to see how everything works, but it's not going to be an official approach for the company." And so they had teams that started that. And so I call them rogue teams. Mike Cohn tells a story of one time he went into an organization that had, talking to the executive, and he said, "We have 3 Agile teams that are going on projects." And Mike went down and talked to the teams, came back to the executive later in the afternoon and said, "You have 4 Agile teams." One of them was just sort of hidden from view. And so that was the way things happened during the early years. You had teams that were trying it, but not many organizations that were trying it. And that changed in the 2005, 2006 era.
Okay, got it. Okay. So Jim, I always have this challenge of explaining what agile is to 2 persons. The first one is my 10-year-old son, right? Well, he's 8 almost. So how would you explain it to these younger kids, right? And the other challenge that I have is when I try to sell agile to a CEO or a VP that has never heard about agile, right? I try to explain it like, hey, your rotation, your motivation, the alignment between the strategy and the day-to-day from the teams, the constant feedback. So I had to mention a lot of stuff. How would you, or how have you in all these years simplified it to explain it to a kid and to a CEO that have never heard about agile?
I have one question and one statement. The question is, Do you see a rising degree of turbulence in your marketplace? Do you see things changing? Do you see technology changing? Do you see the business models changing? Do you see the world we live in changing? Do you think those changes are accelerating? If you do, then we'll call that a turbulent environment, an increasingly turbulent business environment. And so what I would say is that Agile prepares us for a turbulent environment, period.
That's great. That's perfect. Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. That really helps. Jim, you have been part of creating a big thing in the planet. It's called the Agile Manifesto, right? Have you thought about creating some other, maybe getting together with other persons and creating something similar to the manifesto, but for other areas of technology or management or leadership or something, or not?
Well, I did with project management with the Agile Project Leadership Network. It flourished for a few years and then died off for several different reasons. So I was involved in that, and we wrote a document called the Declaration of Interdependence, which was similar to the manifesto, but didn't get the widespread, didn't spread as widely as the manifesto. What I'm involved with now is more along the lines of business agility. So how do you raise agility from basically an IT thing, in which we started with software development and now do product management, but we're still mainly in the IT arena. And if you really want to be agile in your organization, in your business, how do you apply those agile values and principles to the business itself? And again, you want to do that because of the increasingly turbulent business environment and technology environment. You've got to be agile not only in software development, but also in how you approach your business.
Got it. Thank you, Jim. So a question about your career. What was the impact of the Agile Manifesto? So it's published, and then everyone is like you're a rock star, like everyone wants you in the company or consulting firm, or what happens after the manifesto gets big, right? Could you describe it a little?
I got a lot busier.
I can imagine.
So I actually in 1999, 2000, I thought I was going to retire. So I moved to Flagstaff, Arizona as sort of a retirement place. And my work kind of picked up faster than I thought it would. So I did a lot of training and consulting during that 10 years. I did a lot of travel to speak at conferences and to work with clients all over the world. And that was a great time. I really enjoyed it, but I got a little burnt out on the travel, but I really enjoyed working with a whole variety of different organizations, and I talk about several of them in my latest book.
I will get that wild book right away. Okay. So, Jim, what principle or value resonates more with you? Like the one that you say, this is my favorite, right out of the manifesto. Is there one?
Well, I think it would be the first one, because I really believe that people in their interactions and their collaboration and their leadership is at the core of success, and it's also at the core of failure. So if you track back success and failure, it comes down to people. And so I really like the emphasis on people, on collaboration with the customer and collaboration with the team. I think that's a core belief that continues and will continue no matter what different kind of implementation of a process or a methodology that I see. I think that's a core mindset thing that for me will continue.
The interactions, we're living in a different world right now, right? We have a pandemic, etc. So do you still think that we need to go face to face, or would the Slack or Teams or even camera to camera do the job, or do you still consider that we should get together in a room and that's priceless?
Well, I think the cat's out of the bag. I think, you know, we're going to do more remote work or continue to do remote work as a part of the mix. You know, what I see a lot of companies doing is a hybrid. They say you got to come into the office 2 or 3 days a week. The other day, a couple of days, you can work from home. Although I do see some people that are still, you know, basically 100% working from home. So I don't think it matters. Well, I think it does matter which one's best, but I think there's definitely room for both. I know ThoughtWorks is a company that I worked with for 10 years, and they had done a lot of remote work already, but when the pandemic hit, they really reached out to a lot of their clients and showed the clients a lot about doing remote work. So I think there's something to be said for that. I think there's something that you miss in terms of the social interaction, but I think people are going to have, the companies are going to have to learn to deal with how they implement remote versus local. And I think that's going to change over the next few years.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. Jim, were there any debates during the creation of the manifesto, and any, not disagreements, but any topics or any principles or value that were left by the side that didn't make it into the final version? Or
there probably were. I don't remember. You know, that was 20
it was a long time ago.
And all our memories have gotten a little fuzzy. You remember the meeting that I talked about that Kent Beck held in Oregon a year before the manifesto meeting? When I was writing the book, I put in there that Alistair Coburn was one of the quote outsiders invited to that meeting. And when Alistair reviewed the book, he said, "No, I wasn't there." So I had to take it out. So sometimes memory fails you, particularly you get a little older.
Okay, awesome. So, Jim, how are your interactions with the other co-creators? Have you still, get together with them, or are you friends with some, or did that just ended over there?
It varies. Some of them I haven't seen since the manifesto was written. Others I've interacted with, continue to talk to from time to time. I went to a meeting. I went to the Agile conference in Orlando a couple of weeks ago and saw John Kern and Alistair Coburn and James Grenning. So the four of us manifesto authors were there. We had a 10th anniversary meeting in 2011 at the Agile conference where most of the people showed up, and I got to see them again. And we interact occasionally on email, but there's not, it varies depending on, from person to person.
Got it. Okay. Okay, so I have some questions related to timelines, for example. So there's before that, I think there's one more important. Jim, you might have looked at many companies that think that they are doing Agile because they are doing Scrum or Kanban or whatever, but you see them and you say, no, they are not being Agile, right? So there might be a lot of companies or persons looking at this video and saying, well, I am Agile, right? We are doing Scrum, we are doing Safe, Nexus, Less, whatever, right? So what would be the indicators that you have seen that are the hardest to notice or to understand that companies are thinking that they are doing Agile, but they aren't? Where should we look for? What indicators or what places?
Well, as I said earlier, I'm not sure who gets to call whether somebody is being Agile or not. If they think they're being Agile and they're doing some things that are some Agile practices, who's to say that they're not Agile because they don't do X or Y? I know that some people in each of the methodologies who are very strict about what the practices they do. I remember at a conference one time, Ron Jeffries, who is one of the XP originators with Kent Beck, Ron Jeffries was asked the question, if we do the 12 practices of XP, will we be will we be agile? And Ron says, you know, I don't really know anymore. Sometimes I use some of the practices. Sometimes I use other practices. I don't use some of the practices in the 12 practices sometimes. I just sort of pull things together that I need for the particular project at the time and use them. So if somebody was a strict, I have to be doing the 12 practices of XP in order to be an XP Agile proponent, would basically come down on the side that Ron Jeffries, who originated XP, one of the people that originated XP, wasn't very agile. And I think that's ludicrous. So it's a slippery slope when we try to tell somebody they're agile or they're not agile. I think that there are some criteria that you can help people with. So for example, I went into a software company in Silicon Valley one time, and they said, yeah, we're agile. And so I just asked them a few questions. I said, how long are your delivery cycles? And they said, oh, 4 months. And I said, well, you might want to work on that and make it a little sooner. Try 2 months for a while and see if that works. And then if that works, okay, try cutting it down a little bit more. I think you'll be more agile doing it in 2 month cycles than 4 month cycles. And you'll be agile again if you do it in 1 month cycles rather than 2 month cycles. So I could have gone in there and say, oh, you're not doing 2 week cycles, you know, you're not agile. I don't think that would have done much good.
Got it. So it's not like yes, you are doing or not, you're not doing it. It's more of a gray zone, right? Like you can always improve, you can always do it better, but don't be too such as a judge. Like you're
Right.
not doing or you're
The
doing.
one area that I would say is really, really important is, are they adapting their methodologies and their practices to different kinds of projects as they go forward? In other words, are they learning? Do they have a learning loop in there that allows them to actually modify their methodology, or are they stuck at sort of level one? If you think of the levels of maturity for Agile, you've got beginners, you've got intermediates, and you've got advanced or experts. So you've got beginners, you've got intermediates, and you've got experts. I don't think you can move from beginner to intermediate or expert unless you embody mindset, because I think the mindset is one of trying and learning and getting feedback and changing things. And you have to have that to move to more mature levels. So I think where people get stuck is they get stuck at the beginning level and don't evolve from that. And I think that is a problem that you can try to identify in an organization.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you, Jim. Jim, you have been around for many years, right? How have you seen that the leadership or management role has evolved, right? And I'm asking you because many managers look at these videos and say, well, yeah, we have Scrum and everything, but I'm still the manager, right? So what to do if you're in an agile ways of working in a company that is doing agile? If you're a manager, what's your take on that?
Well, I think this is another aspect of what I'd call business agility. You've got to have leaderships that are agile and leaders. So I contrast two implementations in the book for two different companies. One where I would call the leadership was really bought into Agile, understood Agile, and did some things that really proved to their employees that they were committed to an Agile approach, as opposed to another organization of about the same size, where the managers sort of gave lip service to being Agile, but in the final analysis, probably were not very agile in their mindset. They weren't willing to change the way they viewed projects. They weren't willing to forego upfront planning. They weren't really bought into creating collaborative groups. And so you can really tell the difference between an organization where the leadership really understands and promotes agility from organizations where they just sort of give lip service to it. And that's one of the reasons I think we need to, or one of the things that I think is an important step and has been for the last 20 years is getting leadership involved. And that's a tough one to try to get at. But I know there are a lot of people out there that are trying to do that now, that have addressed this idea of business agility, which is basically a leadership initiative.
Got it. Thank you, Jim. I have been with customers. I work in a consulting firm, so I have to go into customers that are trying to be agile and try to coach them or to help them some way, right? That's kind of my job. And I would like to ask you, I've been in companies that have a PMO and then they have their agile centers, right? Or expertise, or however we want, excellence or whatever. So do you see these PMO transforming at some point into agile whatever? Or do you think that the PMO and the Agile Center of Excellence, or how we want to call it, will exist forever? What do you think about the PMO?
Well, let's talk about a traditional PMO that really has been a more of a prescriptive, traditional project management approach, and are not very agile in their outlook. So I think what needs to happen in that case is you need to be transitioning, excuse me, from a project or product management office to a value management office. And people like Sanjeev Augustine at Lightspeed has written a book on this, and it's where a lot of people are going, where we're really trying to capture value rather than some of the traditional metrics. And part of that is implementing a more agile approach to your measurement. One of the things I did in the project management book in the second edition is I kept running into organizations where the agile teams were told, we want you to be agile, we want you to be flexible, we want you to be adaptive, but we want you to meet the traditional scope, schedule, and cost guidelines or plans. And so you were telling people on the one hand to be agile, and you're measuring them with traditional measures. So I changed that was called the iron triangle to be a more agile approach, which was value, quality, and constraints, where the constraints were scope, schedule, and cost. And they constrained the other two, but they weren't the primary objective. The primary objective was delivering customer value. And that sort of measurement system meshed with being flexible and agile and adaptive. And so that's another place that I see leadership needing to be involved is, how do you measure success? What are your measures of success? And they need to match what you're trying to do.
Got it. Okay. Jim, could you share maybe the biggest success of your career, maybe being there for the manifesto, etc.? Maybe you have some other, I don't know. And then also maybe a story about a failure or a big lesson that you have in your career. Probably we can all benefit from that experience.
Well, I would say, I wouldn't say there's one event. I would say that there's a series of events that happened to me over time where I made some major decisions about my career and made some fairly major pivots. And I think obviously the agile community and being part of that for 20 plus years has been my greatest achievement. And I guess in terms of things that didn't go the way I planned or wanted, and that was definitely happened a few times. I was involved in the structured movement in the 1980s and got involved in the case tool, computer-aided software engineering tools during the latter part of the 80s, and got involved with a startup company that went pretty well for a while, and then didn't go so well for a while. So I've been involved in a couple of startups that I learned a lot from, but I learned the lessons from basically not working as opposed to working. So that gave me some incentive as I moved on to other positions. And I guess the other thing that really is important to me is writing. that I love to write, and I try to make things enjoyable as well as useful when I write.
How does your creative process look like? Do you gather a lot of notes for some years, then you put them in a paper, or do you start with a title? How do you do it, Jim?
Well, obviously, there are some things that roll around in your head kind of constantly, and I write a bunch of articles or blog posts now, and like this last book, I never intended to write another book, and as I got writing this, what I thought was an internal family memoir, it sort of grew into something more. My first book, Adaptive Software Development, I started working on that. It started out as a paper, actually a series of papers, and I started working on a book. And I just knew that I wanted to get the book done, whether it ever was sold or was published or not. I wanted to get that done. And so the writing itself, and it kind of depends on your personality, and everybody evolves a writing style. I like to use the Jerry Weinberg's Fieldstone method. I can't start and put out an index and then write from start to finish. I write a little bit in chapter 1, I write a little bit in chapter 9. An idea occurs to me, I write something in chapter 4. So I have a loose idea of the organization, and I sort of plug in pieces. So one of the things that I usually have is I have the manuscript on one side, and I have what I call fieldstones on the other, which are paragraphs to a couple of pages of information on a particular topic. And I will try to work on those, what I call fieldstones. And then when I get them pretty well thought through and done, I'll plug them somewhere into the manuscript. So I go back and forth between the manuscript and these smaller bits of text, these narratives that I'll then plug in, and then I'll reorganize this thing multiple times. So everybody does them a little bit differently. I knew a guy one time whose publisher said, you give us chapter 1, then you give us chapter 2, then you give us chapter 3. I couldn't work in that environment.
Yeah, I agree. Okay. Jim, if you had a time machine, what advice would you give to yourself at the beginning of your journey? Just like Back to the Future.
Well, I think I would say something to myself that I learned over the years, and I put it in the book. The difference between a plan and a purpose for a career. So if I had planned out my career in the beginning, the plan would have gone south very quickly. But I think I had a purpose in mind that really carried me through and allowed me to do various and sundry different things that I hadn't planned, but they still furthered that purpose of improving software development processes and techniques and methodology.
Yeah, I got you. Something like focusing on the outcomes rather than the outputs, right? Rather than the plan. Got it. Okay, thank you for sharing. Jim, any topic or any question you were expecting me to do that I have missed maybe, and you want to provide some guidance or answer it?
I don't think so. I think you covered it pretty well.
That's great. Thank you. So, Jim, just to close, to wrap it up, I really appreciate the conversation. I would like you to share with the audience, what projects are you working on? What are you up to nowadays? And we will put the links of everything that you have, your books, etc., over the description of the video. But is there anything, any places you want to invite the audience, like to buy the books or to your social network, whatever?
Well, I've got 2 initiatives right now that I'm working on to various and sundry degrees. One of which is what I'm calling kind of rejuvenating Agile, which I'm saying back to basics, forward to the future. And I'm trying to involve some people in this initiative to go back to the core of Agile and say the core of Agile is still valid, it's still useful, and we ought to be able to build from there. Like I said earlier, to build extensions onto the manifesto and then build some new things. So I'm trying to say, don't throw everything out. Don't throw all the agile out, because the mindset of agility is still really important, and it's going to be important in the future. But how do we extend what's in the manifesto? How do we extend agile into places where it really needs to be, based on the new situation in the world, the new business initiatives, and the new technology? So that's one of the things that I'm really working on. The second thing I'm really working on is business agility. And so I've got some things that I'm trying to write, some articles about business agility. And I'm working with a couple of different organizations on furthering this idea of business agility. So rejuvenating agile and business agility are the two things that I'm working on right now.
That's awesome. So when you finish any of them and you want to share with the Latin America audience over here, you have the open mics, and this is your house. I really appreciate the time that you gave us today. I think it was pure gold. I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure the audience will learn so much about you. So thank you for that, and wishing you all the best. I hope that we can talk again soon.
Thank you, Hector. I've enjoyed it, and I look forward to continuing the conversation sometime in the future.
Thank you, Jim. Goodbye.
Bye.